So we are now at the third workshop, the third and final workshop on nature-based solutions for disaster and climate resilience and their relevance to business. In the first workshop a couple of weeks ago, we were discussing the business case. Last week, we had a great presentation on the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solution, and today we're going to be focusing on finance and insurance. So welcome. I'd like to start with a few house rules. You're welcome to change your username to your full name and organization, which can also help us when we're reading out your questions. Now, because there are likely to be many of us on the call today, please keep yourself mute. The session is also being recorded, so it'd be helpful if you keep yourself on mute. But you're welcome to interact with us by placing any questions in the chat, and we will do our best to reply to as many of you as possible. We'll also attempt some polling through Mentimeter and to get to know you and also kind of some of your thoughts. For the agenda today, I'm going to attempt first a Mentimeter question. Then we will move on to an overview of this topic by our moderator, who will then pass on to our first speaker today to discuss financing. We'll have time for 1 or 2 questions before going to the next presenter on insurance. And then we will have a relatively long, hopefully, depending on how it goes, Q&A session, hopefully with lots of interaction. So with no further ado, I'm going to attempt to share the Mentimeter. So for Mentimeter, what you need to do is, if you're on a computer, you can open a different browser, or you can go onto your phone if you have that next to you and go on to mentimeter.com. We'll be posting this in the chat. So going into mentimeter.com, and you can use the code 91806908. So this is also being placed in the chat. There's also a direct link to the Mentimeter. And our first question is really to get to know you. Since all this is virtual and we can't have a chat around a coffee, it'd be great to see where you're from. So to give some options of sectors that you could come from, we have nature conservation, we have governance or government, we have agriculture and forestry, finance sector, insurance, infrastructure, other private sector, if I haven't listed any, academia, and also other. Now, if you are joining us and there are many from the other private sector and other category, it would be great if you could type in the chat a bit more details about that. We would love to hear from you. So what type of other private sector are you in? So we have somebody from Watch, we have environmental consultancy, we have oil and gas, I think, if I understood that correctly. Oh, we also have somebody from UNDP, industry. We have a few consultants, somebody working at geospatial solutions company. That sounds interesting. Somebody at fertilizers and chemicals. We've got a very broad range this afternoon. It's great to hear from you. Somebody for landslide risk reduction. Great. Can keep coming in. So what we can see so far is that we seem to have a spread overall. But let's say the majority comes from the other private sector. So we do have a majority of private sector people, quite a few people from academia, which is great to have you here in terms of your research. One from finance, we have a couple from insurance, and a few from the nature conservation, governance, and agriculture and forestry. Okay, just looking again, we've got people working in hydropower, also in the power sector. It's really great to hear from you. Okay, I'm going to pause this here. And without further ado, move on in our agenda And I would like to present to you Alexander, also known as Sasha, Vies from UNEP FI. So that's the UNEP Finance Initiative. He's a technical advisor for sustainable food systems and principles for responsible banking biodiversity targets. Now, he has also got a great experience in banking, because that was his where he was working prior. So Sasha, welcome. The floor is open for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So basically, to give you an introduction why we are having this discussion today. So if you look into the State of Finance paper we released earlier this year in May 2021, then basically there's an 8.1 trillion investment need by 2050. And if you look into the current investment space, then there's a gap of 4.1 trillion, which is kind of half of the money which is needed in order to become nature positive. To give you another perspective, so if we compare climate finance and NbS finance, which actually should go hand in hand to solve our problems around the globe in relation to nature and to climate and disaster problems, then within the climate finance part is 4.5 times bigger in terms of size and investment than the NbS finance part, which is a huge difference for something which should be tackled at the same time at a similar magnitude. And even if we look inside both sections, so if you look into climate finance, then the private sector accounts for more than half of the investments in this area. But if we compare it to the NbS, in addition to being low in absolute terms, the private sector finance is only 14% of the overall financial contribution. So there's a clear need to encourage the private sector to invest in NbS. There's a clear need to come up with new products, new solutions. And from my point of view, there's a clear need for the reinsurance and the banking sector to connect to each other in order to create new products, new solutions, to create new investment opportunities for institutional as well as private sector investors and retail. And basically, with these words of bigger and better collaboration, I would like to hand over to my first speaker, Justine Bolton from First Round. So Justine has a quite big experience in the environmental space. She worked in the financial industry, and she's now responsible for carbon management and climate resilience as a specialist, and she is the environmental sustainable manager at First Round. On top of that, what I found personally quite interesting, she's doing a PhD currently on carbon accounting and Paris alignment. And with these words, I would like to hand over to you, Justine.
Thank you, Sasha. I apologize in advance. I'm struggling with my connection, so I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. I'm struggling to hear you, but if there's trouble with my sound, just wave your arms around and then I'll try and make another plan. Sasha, yeah, you've got my presentation. That's great. So thank you for that introduction. If you wouldn't mind just quickly going past the next slide, which tells a little bit about First Rand, but that's not relevant for today's discussion. So if we move on to the one after that. So today, yeah, talking about the financing side of nature-based solutions. The example that I'm going to use to illustrate this is of a recent investment opportunity we received, a company that farms kelp seaweed forests and makes organic fertilizers. So let's start by looking at the project from the business owner's point of view. The business is that of making fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizers, while quick-acting, nutrient-balanced and cheaper, can have negative impacts on the natural environment, like depleting nutrients from the soil, the potential buildup of chemicals, the synthetic chemicals that go into the product, and the potentially harmful manufacturing processes with high water usage, wastewater, energy costs, not to mention the greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts related to fertilizer production and use. In this case, though, the business owner considered the potential negative environmental impacts of the activity and then considered the possibility of a nature-based solution to turn these into positives. He put together a proposal for an organic fertilizer production business using the sustainably farmed and harvested kelp seaweed. The benefit of kelp fertilizer is that it is a natural product with minimal processing involved. It's sustainable, biodegradable, and environmentally friendly, amongst other benefits. Natural kelp beds can be sustainably maintained and harvested to provide large quantities of organic fertilizer with a much lower environmental and carbon footprint. The kelp forests themselves provide an important habitat for many marine animals. They provide other ecosystem services like buffering coastlines against the effects of storm surges. They help to cleanse water by absorbing excess nutrients, and they provide a huge opportunity for nature-based solutions to climate change mitigation through carbon sequestration and storage, if they are well managed and sustainably harvested. The next step for the business owner was to look for financing or investment into the business. So he did some homework researching different banks' products offerings and their funding solutions, like if they had sustainably linked bonds or green bonds, as well as their focus areas and sustainability reports. The business owner reached out to our bank with his proposal that contained details about his sustainable solution and planned efficiencies and savings that would provide a return on the investment, as well as other key positives, such as the sustainable farming and preservation of the kelp forests. This speaks to productive landscapes, safeguarding nature, conservation actions, as well as the jobs provided to local people and a boost to the local economy. This addresses societal challenges, and the potential greenhouse gas savings and positive climate impacts. We've already heard in this series that nature-based solutions could provide around 30% of the cost-effective climate mitigation needed by 2030 to stabilize global warming, and can also provide a powerful defense against the impacts and long-term hazards of climate change. This kelp farming project is a good example of this potential and of how one can work with ecosystems how sustainably using natural capital can help play a role in achieving these goals. This kelp farming project is again a good example of an innovative conservation effort that can help to protect, manage and restore the environment and help mitigate against climate change while delivering tangible and as a business owner, you can always make use of these services when planning and looking for financing options. I see a message there that my sound has cut out. Am I back online?
Yeah,
No,
we can hear you again. Maybe if you turn your camera off, that might improve.
Perspective. The First Rand Group shares a global concern about climate change and biodiversity loss. We have committed to a number of initiatives, such as the Principles for Responsible Banking, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, we've been participating in industry forums such as the PRB Biodiversity Targets Working Group, as well as the informal working group leading to the establishment of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And we have recently joined as a partner to PBAF, the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting and Financials, all in order to learn from and contribute to the emerging narrative on biodiversity and natural capital impacts and dependencies for financial institutions, and to enhance the current deep focus on climate risks and impacts taking place in the FirstRand Group. It's important to ensure that the group remains vigilant in our lending activities with regards to negative and positive impacts of our clients' business activities on biodiversity and climate change. So when an application for credit is received, it passes through a due diligence process. FirstRand's Environmental and Social Risk Assessment Due Diligence Process, or ESRA, identifies and assesses any potential environmental, social and regulatory or reputational risks to either FirstRand or its clients, and includes a built-in negative screening exclusion list and a restricted list of sensitive activities, which cover high conservation areas, deforestation, fishing, seabed trawling, palm oil, animal welfare, amongst other things. Our risk appetite is currently being adjusted to more comprehensively look at sustainable solutions, so to consider nature-based solutions, natural capital impact and dependencies, as well as climate impacts. When we do a due diligence on a credit transaction, we look at the potential impact of what the activity is going to be, and if nature positive, it already counts in the favor of the application. If nature negative, we will check whether the risk is acceptable or reversible. Our ESRA due diligence process has been in place for a number of years, looking at impacts and now including dependencies as well. So whether the project or activity is nature positive or nature negative determines our appetite to finance it. FirstRand also has a sustainable debt issuance framework that makes specific provision for nature-based solutions, providing targeted lending and investment into these kind of projects or activities. The framework originated from requirements that were set out by our agreement with the IFC. They gave us some targets and some activities that they would consider to be green, and those were incorporated into the Sustainable Debt Issuance Framework. The framework has been enhanced using the EU Green Taxonomy to set parameters and measurables, and we're currently engaging with the South African National Treasury on the establishment of a Green Taxonomy for South Africa. This is based on the EU Taxonomy. It doesn't yet include a lot of biodiversity activities, but that's the next phase after they've worked on climate mitigation and adaptation. So really what the Sustainable Debt Issuance Framework does is provide eligibility criteria to qualify for positive impact finance, which can potentially open up new funding lines and help the direction of financial flows to these kind of activities. So it's important that we need to be able to measure the positive impact, starting with the baseline usually, and then what is the measurable impact going forward. And this comes back to what I mentioned earlier about our involvement with the principles of responsible banking, in particular the Biodiversity Targets Working Group, as well as PBAF and the Green Taxonomy development, all to help us develop measurable KPIs and metrics so that we can track performance and set targets and better direct these financial flows. So going back to the kelp farming example, in the context of FirstRand's climate and biodiversity goals, the bank received the application for financing. It was assessed through a due diligence process and the Sustainable Debt Issuance Framework, and the positive impact finance opportunity was clearly recognized. So as a result, FirstRand has taken 100% equity stake in this company. But this approach applies both to the bank's lending and investment. The bank is always looking for at sustainable solutions, whether it's through our own capital, whether it's through development finance or through blended finance solutions where we partner with external counterparties to help manage any residual risks or maximize the opportunities. Even in FirstRand's corporate social responsibility area, there is the opportunity to focus on specific sustainable development goals and implement the principles of responsible banking as we focus on building resilience, sustainable food production, climate risks, and natural adaptation. And we hope to combine our business initiatives with community initiatives to have a wide reach in the work that we do. So if you can move on to the last slide. I hope that the example I've given and the information I've shared has demonstrated how we can support the positive role that nature plays in societal changes, such as climate change, food security, and disaster risk reduction. Unfortunately, many people, both inside the bank and externally, don't quite understand the value and dependency on natural capital and the solutions that nature can provide. And we need to raise this awareness and build capacity in this field. So for this reason, we're actually embarking on a huge awareness and raising and training drive, not only of our own internal community of 50,000 people, but to our consumers as well, as we're also trying to do with our climate change and its mitigation and adaptation. So yes, we're still learning ourselves and improving our own understanding so that we can explore new opportunities and financing solutions that address the issues of climate, biodiversity, and natural capital, and especially in the context of a just transition to a low carbon economy, which is very important in South Africa. We have a rich biodiversity and a huge natural capital, but need to ensure that production and consumption is sustainably managed to maximize opportunities of providing jobs, boosting the economy, and at the same time mitigating for climate change and being nature positive. So the next challenge for us is to define robust KPIs and targets, and to obtain granular data at the client or asset class level to measure against these KPIs. And I think there's also the opportunity for the creation of an enabling framework that creates incentives for nature-based solutions and disincentives for nature negative actions, sort of like, the carbon tax, that would help banks to channel financial flows towards nature positive investments. Thank you. I'll leave it at that, and I hope that came across clearly, and I look forward to any questions or comments coming out of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine. So Natalie, we're having the first Q&A session right now, correct?
Yeah, if there are any direct questions for Justine, please type them in the chat. That would be great. So otherwise,
probably I'll ask the first question.
Great.
Yes. So the first question. So I quite like this practical example on how NbS finance can be implemented on the ground. So from KPI perspective, as far as I understood your presentation, Justine, is there any KPIs which are implemented over the time period of the loan, so until the end, or is it just in the beginning when the loan is given out to certain companies or equity to certain companies or within certain projects?
So I'm just reading Jonathan's interpretation of the question. So you're looking at KPIs that are implemented over the time period of the loan.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It speaks to all of our impact areas that we report on in terms of our principles of responsible banking. The main focus being mitigation of climate change. So I mean, to be honest, Sasha, as I say, we're still learning and trying to develop these KPIs, but it does speak to already local jobs created, local economies supported. It will speak to, hopefully, as you mentioned, I'm doing some further studying in carbon accounting, so we'd like to also start measuring the carbon emissions in these kind of finance projects. So definitely we can start looking at carbon emissions saved or reduced. So the basic measurements and KPIs are there that we report on already, to the funding lines, but we want to make that better and make it more focused on the positives, so the climate and the nature positive. So that's definitely something we're working on.
Okay, there's another question coming in. So are there any trainings or education you have internally? I would probably enhance this question. On a front office basis, so front office people who are like the first line from a bank perspective, and for your clients on the importance of nature-based solutions and on the importance of the finance?
So I mentioned our ESRA, our environmental social risk assessment process. So that actually our frontline transactors are trained in when a loan application comes in. That's the first sort of line of defense. They're trained to categorize that loan, and then we have ESRA transactors who work on that front line, who look at how to categorize that loan, what sector it is in, what the environmental and climate sensitivities may be around that. As I say, it's been in place for many years, and it's sort of it's up until recently focused mainly on the negative, so to prevent any negative impacts. But that's where we're doing a lot of work now. Firstly, to train our staff, those frontline staff, and our risk professionals within the group on climate change. So how do you start bringing climate change considerations into all of these transactions, whether it's on the front line, or whether it's the risk assessment, or whether it's the credit ratings? How do you start incorporating climate impacts and risks from that? And then the next focus is to do the same with biodiversity and natural capital as well. And then we're definitely looking at so we're currently putting together a training module on sort of climate change 101, and then the next module is sort of more going into the risk side of it. That will be rolled out throughout the whole of FirstRand and our divisions. And we want to then try and look at expanding that into how do we start offering that kind of training and awareness raising outside to our clients and customers as well. Sort of a general awareness raising through video modules and things like that. And then on the specific portfolio level, with our, for example, in our agricultural portfolio, our bankers are sometimes more knowledgeable than us when it comes to on the ground impacts and dependencies on biodiversity and threats from climate change. So they are well positioned to engage with our clients, work with the farmers, talk about the potential threats from a changing climate and what that means in terms of maybe rainfall or temperature or any transition risks that may be coming in, and how does the client adapt to that, so they're able to advise whether it's from climate smart agriculture or changing the varieties that are, so they're more climate resistant, so they're able to engage with the clients on a more direct level as well.
Yeah, coming to the next question. So one question coming from the audience: is there anything from the government which is coming as a, let's say, as a support for enabling NbS finance? Are you working with the government? Are you working with any government grants? Can you shed some light into this direction?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question. I probably, I'm not as close to we've got the sustainable finance team that may have knowledge of something that I don't. I would at a guess say at the moment the focus is pretty much on climate change as well. There's a huge focus on climate change and the just transition. I guess the just transition does also incorporate, the environmental aspects as well. But yeah, sorry, I don't have the answer to that question personally.
No worries. So another one coming from the audience, and this is probably quite into your space. So the interaction between NbS finance and voluntary carbon offsetting programs, is there any linkage you're having? can we link NbS finance and KPIs somehow?
I didn't quite hear you, but I'm reading the question, the linkage between nature-based solution and voluntary carbon offsets.
Yes.
So that's an exciting, definitely, that's an exciting space that we're looking at playing in. We're looking at a lot of carbon opportunities. Obviously, we're also looking at our own goals and targets, and how and whether we can set net zero targets. We all need to sort of move together and support the Paris Agreement goals through setting net zero targets. The next step is to try and understand how one does that by setting these science-based targets. We've done that on our own operation, and we're looking at how to do it through our lending and investment. But I definitely see the linkage between nature-based solution and carbon offsets. I referred to it in my presentation, but also I'm sure it's been mentioned throughout this sort of series of lectures, as well as that potential for carbon mitigation and carbon sequestering through nature-based solutions has been identified at around 30% of what is needed. So we're looking at solutions in terms of whether it's carbon credits or working with our clients to help them achieve those emissions reductions in their activities or in their businesses. And then how do we monetize those carbon credits possibly, and sort of to feed back into the loop and start driving further reductions. So there's definitely an interaction between it. It's sort of like a feedback loop. If they can reduce their emissions and we can monetize it and offset, put that back into offsetting and reducing their emissions further, that's an exciting place that we're looking at.
Excellent.
I hope that's answered the question.
Yes, this is quite interesting. I think it's especially like the linkage to the carbon market, because it's something which is measurable and which is already a long time monetizable in the market, is quite an interesting route. So thank you very much for answering the questions. I'm going to move to my next presenter. So it's Philippe Rahinlich, who is the head of Americas at Swiss Re. He's a managing director and responsible for public solutions. So he is leading a team of dedicated team members who engage on federal, on national, on state level, and on with municipal governments. He has some connection within his work with the World Bank and regional development banks on bringing NbS and nature-related solutions forward. Philippe spent most of his time at Swiss Re, so he has a huge experience, and he knows Swiss Re inside out, I would say, as he spent in front office roles, in risk and quantitative roles, and now as head of public solutions for Americas. So over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Sasha. And good day to all of you. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have maybe a lot of slides, so I'll try to go fast, but I think they will be available to you after the presentation. This is a little bit about Swiss Re, right? We are a very large, leading global reinsurer, but also commercial property casualty insurer. And, at the end of the day, what we do as insurer and reinsurer is to absorb shocks, being large natural catastrophe events, man-made events, or mortality type of extreme events, as the unfortunate situation we all find ourselves through COVID. And these shocks, we are here to support our clients, to support communities. And that's why our mission is to make the world more resilient. And obviously, we are paying a keen interest in nature-based solutions and all the implications of natural assets, protecting them, covering them and so forth. So I will tell you in this presentation a bit how we look at it and the solutions we have developed, like Justin shared with us some examples. I'll do the same. If you go to the next slide, Natalie, you see here what we are tracking, monitoring as Swiss Re, what we call the protection gap. It's basically the difference between this pink line here and the yellow one, where you see the economic losses related to natural catastrophes. and the insured losses, the ones that the insurance industry is absorbing. And we see the gap growing, and we need to do something about it. We need to be more innovative. We need to be more, a greater risk taker. We need to partner with the government, with the public sector to find solutions. And then comes the dimension of nature-based solutions or natural assets, which are not even reflected in these graphs because we're still struggling to put a proper price on these natural assets and then to come up with solutions. So this is the gap where we are trying to address and to resolve. And if you go to the next slide, I wanted to share with you some of the figures on this gap when it comes to natural assets. You heard Sasha, he gave us some very impressive numbers. You heard Justin with the numbers. These are mine when it comes to looking at the contribution and the dependency of nature to the global GDP, 55%. This is based on the research we have done on biodiversity. When you think about the economic value provided by coral reef, 36 billion, related to the tourism activities, and that will drive some ideas and some solutions that we are developing. Again, the resilience that a coral reef or mangrove can be providing to population or to property, this is huge. That's why we need to be involved and find solutions here and close the gap. So if you go to the next slide, here we're just saying, look, if we are acknowledging the benefits of nature, if we see the dependencies between nature, businesses, life, health issues, societal issues, we need to integrate these dependencies, these benefits into our decision making. We need to find solutions, right? And that's why, here we are very much engaged as Swiss Re for some time. That's why you are all joining today, because we all want to be addressing it and finding solutions. And I have to say, we are the beginning of the journey. We still have to raise awareness. We still need to talk about it. This is not an accomplished situation where here we need to be pushing and raising the topic. We need a broader, bigger community to respond to the challenge. And there we will be able to ensure and to help not only businesses, where they need to acknowledge and also assess how their businesses, their revenue is actually linked to natural assets. Also investors, you heard Justin, how insurance can be de-risking some projects and improving, investors' confidence to go on board on projects. And finally, government, when they are impacted by, a natural event, a big shock, how can we help them to restore the natural assets, to clean up, and so forth. So we are serving through insurance solutions these three stakeholders. If you go to the next slide, that's maybe the most interesting, important slide. Spend some time on this one because it provides some illustration on solutions, actual real solutions we developed to protect natural assets at Swiss Re. The first one on the left side is what we call pre-event. It was basically in 2019, an insurance coverage we provided to a construction risk on an island in the Netherlands, on the island of Texel. And the island had a dike. The dike needed to be restored by the community, as the island was attracting tourism and so forth. And so the restoration of the dike took place, and we collaborated with the water management company. We collaborated with the engineering team and the local authorities on the island to provide a plain construction risk cover and allow these natural assets to be restored. Even though it is traditional, it was innovative by the underlying natural asset that was being restored. This construction project got a lot of recognition. It was on a World Heritage site, and it gained a lot of prize, with all the implication on biodiversity and the benefits that came out from this nature-based insurance solutions pre-event, right? The event being, water surge coming from the sea. We have the other example is on the right side. That's a post-event type of situation, where there were some studies conducted on the reef, on the coral reef of Mexico, around the Quintana Roo Bay Area in Mexico, assessing the impact of the coral reef in lowering the impact of hurricane as hurricane were going and hitting the beach. And so that assessment done by scientists really proved the benefit of the coral reef and the importance of restoring the coral reef after a hurricane. So we got involved, this is back in 2017, we got involved with the Nature Conservancy. So we needed a very important partner here, the Nature Conservancy from the region. We have the Mexican government involved. We had the local universities on the research side. We had the property owners, right? The hotels on the beach and so forth, and us, Swiss Re, to develop a solution. The solutions post-event was what we call a parametric insurance solution. I will explain a little bit more in a few minutes, but it's basically based on the strength of the wind hitting the beach. Based on that trigger, could a payment be provided to the local authorities in order for them to pay a brigade? Here it's a picture of the brigade that will be going into the water to restore the reef after the event. And that's what we created back in 2017. This program has been renewed every year, and actually last year it paid out. We had there was a big hurricane, I think it was called Delta, going through the Mexican region, and $800,000 were paid to cover the damage and restore the reef here. So this is an ongoing program we have in the market. If you go on the next slide, in a nutshell, I try to summarize again what I described when it comes to the first example, which is an indemnity-based insurance solution, and the second example on the Mexico reef, which is more parametric. And the big difference between one and the other is speed. Speed to provide funding to the policyholders that are impacted. With the indemnity-based insurance, you will have the traditional coverage being put in place with a loss estimate being conducted, an adjuster coming on site, and then the payment being paid or the payment being processed to the policyholder with the time that it takes to get this kind of solutions resolved. Now, on the parametric insurance side, you have to define the trigger of the event, which can be wind speed, right? It can be also water surge level and things like that. And that parametric trigger will be the element that will decide if a payment is made or not. And you can see here the payment can be rather quick, within 2 weeks to 3 weeks. And so, in a nutshell, I wanted to highlight a little bit one mechanism versus the other, both being applied to nature-based solutions. If you go to the next slide, we see a little bit what is needed to enable a solution to come together. And it's not that simple. I can tell you we're looking at a lot of opportunities. I was very interested with what Justin was saying, because we need to find all the parties, all the elements, all the components to be able to answer to the risk and provide a solution to the risk. So first, we need to identify the asset. What do we want to protect? And often when we talk to our clients, as the discussion goes on, you realize actually, the underlying asset is not so clearly defined or clearly, understood. And then comes the next question around what kind of risk are you looking to cover? Is it flood? Is it drought? Is it wildfire? What is it that your natural asset is affected against or threatened by? And then you need to determine how the payout will be provided. Where will it go? Is it about repairing? What will be the use of the coverage in the type of the kind of the transaction we had in Mexico? It was about restoration, so that needs to be defined. And then finally, the premium funding. These transactions have to be funded. They are commercial transaction ultimately, and that has to be very clear from the beginning. And you need to think about how you're going to be sustaining these solutions over time. This is not a one-off and then the risk disappear. The risk will come back. So it's not only about the funding, but also the sustainability of the funding of these solutions. And again, we feel at Swiss Re, we're very much involved. We're talking to a lot of parties, and we realize often the parties are not aware exactly what they want to insure, how they're going to be funding it. And we need to make progress in raising awareness, assessing the risk, talking to stakeholders so we can really develop and find solutions for these natural assets. If you go to the next slide, I try to be a little bit quick so we have time for Q&A. A little bit the 3-3 approach, historically on sustainability and nature-based more specifically. But I wanted to show you that back in 1979, already 40 years ago, we were raising awareness in the industry around climate risk. And I can tell you that at that time, that was seen as a emerging risk, right? And there were very few parties around the table talking with us, like us, about the growing risk of climate change. And things have improved and changed, and here we are increasing the dialogue, which is fantastic. 2009, that's when we at 3-3 introduced a sustainability risk framework. This is very similar to what Justin was describing. At 3-3, it started in 2009. On the underwriting side, providing clear guidance to the underwriters, how to think about the sustainability implications of an underwriting decision. And then on the asset side, also when it comes to making investment decisions. 2017, that's when we shifted our entire investment portfolio under ESG benchmarks. And then you can see later on the type of commitment we have made towards being net zero greenhouse gas emissions across our entire business by 2050. So quite a large and strong commitment from 3-3. If you go to the next slide, we are also mapping our insurance portfolio to the SDGs. And here we try to think, based on product solutions and also concrete transactions with clients, how do we contribute to the SDG? Could it be obviously and hopefully positively? Could it be negatively, or could it be neutral? And that's the indicator and the assessment we conduct across our portfolio. If we go to the next slide, you can see that we are developing a tool, what we call an insurance SDG Cakulator, that will help us, right, to measure and to steer our portfolio about the sustainability nature label implication of our underwriting. We do it for ourselves, and then we are sharing this with our clients, with our partners, the same way we have been sharing the sustainability framework we implemented in 2009, or the shift of the investment portfolio of 3-3 under ESG benchmarks already in 2017. All that we develop internally, and then we share it with clients and partners. And then here on this slide, you have the latest work we have done on biodiversity. We developed an index. Biodiversity, we look at different, 10 kind of biodiversity and ecosystem criteria to define the biodiversity of the different regions around the world. We have that on a geo risk map that we provide to clients. It helps us to assess not only the typical insurance hazard, such as wind, flood, and so forth on a map, but also the biodiversity risks in the world. And therefore, when it comes to underwriting or investment decisions, we have a better sense of the implications. And again, this is a tool we developed in-house, which we make available to our clients. Now, my final slide are also a little bit about the challenges, right? This is really, really hard. It's hard work for all of us. We know about it. There are some, good news, but we need to continue the effort and push. So first, we need to, make sure we understand and appreciate the value of these natural assets. Then we need to find scale. As I said, we are too small, regional in the experience. So we need to find scale to have a real impact. Then we need to be sharing a little bit this experience, and that's exactly what we're doing today. So that's a great opportunity. Thanks again to the UNEP for organizing the event. We can move into standardization. We heard Justine. All this work is very, very important. So we can, scale and implement all these ideas and solutions more effectively and make them more attractive for investors and for insurers. And at the end of the day, we also need to find the right regulatory government incentives, right? And they can also play a role in accelerating, increasing the work here. We know, you had a good question, Sasha, around which country is involved and so forth. We know that some countries are really showing, taking the lead and being very, innovative in that field. I will mention Canada, definitely. We've seen, a lot of organizations like the World Bank, or even I think recently was FEMA in the US that came out with the paper on nature-based solutions. It's fantastic. That we need more of these kind of, contribution thoughts to raise awareness and get the market to grow and to gain scale for, having a real impact on the benefits of these natural assets and why it's critical to cover them, to finance them, and to insure them. And with that, I'm happy to close and give you back the mic, Sasha.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I'm always impressed how insurance and reinsurance companies can value these assets, can value the risks, and can transfer them even into revenue streams. This is something which has been beyond my skills, but I was always impressed when I was involved in construction with reinsurance companies. And so basically, from your perspective, there's a strong need to value natural assets at the right premium with the right tools. So the tools on your side are internal, or are there like publicly accepted tools like in the option pricing industry?
Right. Look, it's a huge challenge. Maybe I make it feel and sound easy, but it's very hard, right? It's very hard. Because you can think about, okay, you can protect the natural asset, and you need to value the natural asset. And if you are lucky, because natural asset is in an urban area or a place where there are, existing figures and data, you can actually give it a price, right? Or if it is not, then the price can be seen as zero or not even defined. So that's the real challenge. But we're looking also at aspects where there is actually an underlying price. Or you can think about pricing the natural asset on the protection it provides to the revenue. So based on the revenue stream you can see out of the tourism activity or so forth, you can figure out the price. Or the natural asset is part of a construction project, right? Like the first example I gave in the Netherlands, and then you can come up with the price. So do you have different type of scenario where you can think about, okay, how do I value this natural asset? Now, when it comes to expertise, I would say, Swiss Re, that's our brand, right? That's our value recognition. It's the expertise, it's the knowledge, the number of expert scientists we have at Swiss Re, the internal models we have available. We are in a very, privileged situation, but also that makes the difference, right, to many other players. And so a lot of these findings, assessment, modeling, risk assessment is proprietary, internally related, driven by Swiss Re. The biodiversity index I mentioned is a Swiss Re index. We have developed resilience index. They're all in-house. But of course, we benchmark what we do with the outside world, with third-party modelers, providers, to balance and check our understanding of the risk. So I would say in our case, it's primarily driven by us internally, but you can find some tools, thank God, because we need more players in this market to also help and support in assessing risk and making progress. When you think about this protection gap, the protection gap is so huge, right? So you need more Swiss Re, so we need more players.
I can imagine, and basically, so the natural assets themselves are, common assets. They are not, most of them do not, or biodiversity does not belong to any owner. So who is paying the premium, and who should be paying the premium?
Yeah, so again, it's a little bit of a case-by-case basis. We try to, put into some kind of grid, depending of the natural assets, if it's coral reef, mangrove, sandbanks, whatever. What are the beneficiary of these natural assets, right? What could be the potential threats, and what kind of solutions you could develop, right? So we're trying to find categories to analyze a little bit the risk landscape, but then you realize when you go into a discussion with the potential partner that every situation, every dialogue is a little bit different. And so that's why we need this scale, we need this standardization, we need these efforts to bring more people around the table and standardize and find the right taxonomy, back to the initiative that Justine was mentioning, so that we can be more, quick, efficient, cost-effective in finding solutions, right? So we have so many examples where we came across a discussion, we read an article, a paper was produced by the Nature Conservancy or another environmental agency. We follow up and we realize actually it's not clear if the natural asset has been valued, if the natural asset is actually threatened, and then the dialogue starts, and then you realize it's a long journey, it's a long discussion, and you need more parties around the table to get an agreement about, again, back to the slide I was showing in terms of defining the risk, defining the asset, defining who pays the premium, and so forth. It's almost a bit of a, for us in our experience, it's a bit of a case by case experience, which is unfortunate, which shows the challenge to bring again enough minds and support from the academic science side from the government to help standardize this market.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, and from the presentation as well, there's prevention is better than paying for the loss afterwards. So,
well, yeah.
So the question would be, how can we put, or what can we put in place as monitoring, or as a let's say as a monitoring plan, in order to improve protection of natural assets? So having some kind of preventive measures instead of sitting on the damage once the damage is done.
Sure. I would say, okay, by nature, an insurance solution, it will be always preemptive, right? We're telling a client, be prepared for the event and be ready to pay a premium, because I'm a contingent investor. I will be covering the losses if the event happens, but you have to think about it preemptively, right? And now often, there is no action, and then post-event, they raise taxes, they look for funding, they raise debt, and then they think about maybe next time I need to be insured, okay? Mm-hmm. So I will always argue in favor of being preemptive, okay? Now, obviously, in terms of what can be done, what tools can be implemented to prepare, right, to anticipate. Here, I will refer to this biodiversity index that we developed. It's very hard to measure how resilient or weak is a region to water quality, to air quality, right, to the animal population and so forth. And this index we have developed and put on the map is exactly trying to achieve that, right? So before you make an underwriting decision, if you want to be underwriting a dam, or you want to be underwriting an infrastructure project, or if you want to be investing in a country, in a region, how fragile is this environment already today, right, from a biodiversity ecosystem standpoint? And will your decision improve or not the situation? And could you be blamed, or could you be in trouble from a reputation standpoint if you move forward? So these are the tools, right, that we have developed and we make available to our clients to measure and assess the potential implication of your decisions on biodiversity. And therefore, if you can invest on the natural assets to preserve the assets, then you will be benefiting the community, and then it will be more of a positive impact to again the region, right? So this is the way we will think about it, and we will look at it.
Okay, so probably now 2 questions which are for both presenters and which are probably slightly provocative. So if you look into change happening, there are 2 ways. We have industry-led initiatives like green bond standards, blue bond standards, sustainability-linked standards, and then we have regulation like the EU taxonomy. So in respect to NbS, what would be the best way to increase financial flows into NbS.
That's right. Yes, you hear me, Sasha?
Yes, now I hear you.
Okay, sorry. Now I was saying, maybe I'll start quickly. So it's all about convergence to me. Yeah, these two have to happen and converge and come together. I know on the taxonomy side, on the European side, there were some concerns at the beginning about how far the EU was going and so forth. But we need government to be involved. We need them to work together with the industry to develop this taxonomy, and we need these industry initiatives to support and to converge together, right? So it has to be a joint approach. On the NbS side, as I said, I believe we're still at the beginning. The initiatives we come across are great, but they are too regional, right? They're too much driven by some organizations or some countries, and we need a global kind of view, right? If you think about accounting, right? How long is taking the world to come from a simple accounting start? So NbS, right? It's such an ambition. So here's the journey. It's a long journey. It's super exciting. A lot of parties are talking about it, but this is the beginning. A lot of efforts of convergence have to happen. And I'm curious to hear from Justine, because she was, mentioning a lot of initiatives where, First Rank is involved. So I'm sure she has a view.
Thanks, Philippe. I agree with what you said there. We're at the beginning. It's going to require a concerted effort from all the players. I certainly think, that the taxonomy plays a role in terms of providing boundaries and barriers and buckets that one can sort of start to categorize these solutions and these investments in. I think particularly for me, coming from the sort of carbon accounting perspective, it's all about metrics and measurables there. I mean, for us, we want to measure change, measure impacts, measure progress, but one can't do that until one understands what one is measuring. So that's where those KPIs come in. And Sasha, you've been involved with the principles of responsible banking and the biodiversity targets group, and even in that, we're working on how do you define and improve those KPIs. So in many of these working groups, it's still trying to get one's head around what do you measure, how do you define it, and then how do you start measuring it. So, and that's a collaborative effort of science, of industry, of all sorts of experts coming together. To me personally, that's sort of a big driver. Is once the saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. So once we've got a better handle on that, I think it'll also help going forward into improving those flows towards it, because you know what you're aiming for.
Okay, so I totally agree. Like the KPIs bit is crucial in order to make sure that basically, if we create any kind of financial products, that we can make sure that the money reaches the right project at sufficient scale. This is like a minimum requirement. But then on the other side, from a government point of view and from a regulator point of view, policymakers can decrease or remove some of the barriers in order for NbS to prosper. What would be those barriers? Who wants to start?
I can have a go at that, if you don't mind, Philippe. So when you sort of said that, the carbon tax comes to my mind. It's a pricing mechanism on carbon emissions. So some sort of pricing mechanism or tax mechanism or government incentive that puts a price on these ecosystem services or nature-based solutions that possibly considers the effects of climate change and the carbon pricing and something like that. If there's taxes for negative behavior and financial incentives for positive behavior, nature positive activities based on that, perhaps that's a solution. Just an idea.
No, Agree, Justin. Maybe I will take it from a financial institution standpoint, because we need also our regulators, right, to support what we're doing, and because we are a huge catalyst, right? We are a huge driver of change, right? Banks, insurers, asset managers, and that's why they're paying attention to us and they are engaging us. But sometimes I hear them being more concerned about our exposure than finding the right, positive incentive, right? When it comes to recognizing the benefits of our solution. So maybe they can be treated differently, i.e. from a capital regime standpoint, right? And, but we have this debate with the regulators on other asset class, like infrastructure. And now we're already thinking about nature-based solutions asset class. So again, this is the beginning, but it has to happen, right? They need to see the benefits we provide in supporting the SDGs in ESG and NbS, and then create the right incentives for insurers, for banks to grow, right, their exposure, their work on the asset side, on the liability side. And again, there are some good dialogues and good discussions, and we see, in insurance, the IIS, or the EU, definitely, but we also, hear their concern and their request for more disclosure or more capital charges. And so that's the balance we need to find with them to create the right incentives.
So if I understand it correctly, you suggest to have like NbS as an additional asset class in Solvency II.
My God. Is it realistic or is it science fiction? I don't know. Right?
Okay.
It's good to talk about it. Why not? We're very far. We're very far. But okay. Hopefully at some point, hopefully this market will be big enough, large enough that it will be, benefiting for a lot of attention investments. And then we can go into, from a capital Solvency II standpoint, or Swiss Solvency Test, or US RBC. How do you treat the investment of that? It will come. But it's a long, dialogue before we get there. But it's good to raise it.
I also picked that up in your response, Philippe, that recognizing nature-based solutions as its own asset class, and it's almost recognizing that intrinsic value in the capital markets that it provides. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay, another question which comes from the morning session, but which I can combine with the question asked by the audience in the afternoon session as well. So far, there are limited products for retail in the retail space. So basically, the generation of my children, and probably even my generation, they're quite nature and biodiversity positive, and they're okay to spend money for NbS if we can solve the problems, but there are no products out there. And so basically, there are some, I guess, minimum requirements for NbS solutions for both institutions, for Swiss Re and for First Trend, and minimum size and loan terms, and loan terms subject probably to KPIs. Question is, how does it work right now, and what needs to happen for the public to invest into these kinds of solutions? Who wants to start first?
I think just
okay, thanks, Philip. I wouldn't say there's no solutions. I think there's very few solutions on the retail side. I think maybe the solutions that there are small scale and don't have a big impact, whether it's from just like a savings account with interest rates and sort of benefits that are linked to nature or conservation. I mean, I know in South Africa, we've got a few products in the market that perhaps support conservation and local initiatives. So what was your question? Sort of how do we improve that?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I think by asking these kind of questions, you know, if the market is speaking, if the youth are demanding these kind of products and solutions, the financial institutions need to take notice. It's an opportunity missed if they don't. So on the sort of financial technicality side, I don't know the answer for that, but I think it's certainly an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. I'll leave it at that. Philippe, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, no, I think it will come. You know, the same way you have ESG funds, and they are more and more open to the public. We will find NbS funds, right? And the banks will be able to carve out their investment portfolio and say, you know, this instrument is going into this kind of activities, and therefore link it back to NbS. But then it will have to be, you know, recognized, approved, and so forth, right? So back to the standardization. But I will guess that it will happen, but not yet. On the insurance side, it's more difficult. But obviously, you know, an insurance company, by its commitment, its engagement on ESG and its disclosure, can put an ESG label, right, a sustainability label to their activity, and then go and attract clients by saying, if you take property insurance with me, you can make sure that, you know, my activities will also turn to that kind of segment, which can be NbS, right? So they can use that to their advantage. And again, you know, nothing has been developing that way yet, but we're working on it for sure, right? Every insurer, when it comes to their sustainability report, their engagement, their positioning, particularly when they are publicly traded insurers, right, to their investors, they are promoting this dimension, and NbS can be a big driver of their communication to the outside world, and therefore attract clients, including the millennials or the young generation, that may say, this company is more green than that one, so I will take that insurer as my, you know, homeowner insurer or car insurer. So yeah, it's behind, right? It's definitely behind from the marketing standpoint, but it needs to be a reality, you know, not only marketing.
Yeah, the thing is, so what I've seen so far in the insurance space, which I found quite fancy. So there's a car insurance in Germany, and they are planting trees for CO2 reduction measures. So I found it quite fancy idea to combine the car insurance and for the cars which are emitting CO2. Yeah. And combining it with planting trees, so you know where your CO2 is captured over the next couple of years.
Exactly. Where is the premium going on the asset side to fund nature-based nature assets? Yeah, true.
So probably two last questions. One is, the question is on NbS washing. I think it's coming from greenwashing, and so how can we avoid then, you know, NbS washing happening in the NbS space? And then I will do a provoking question at the end to wrap up.
I'll have a go at the NbS washing first. I think it's like, you know, it's the same as a greenwashing. Different companies can say different things, and it's like comparing apples with oranges. That's where the value of having these standardized guidance and frameworks come in, because it ensures sort of harmonized reporting. Entities are measuring the same similar boundaries, the same metrics. It makes it comparable across organizations. Transparency is also important, because then you can see what organizations are measuring, what's in and what's out. Again, that makes it comparable between companies. So, and going back to my previous answer of sort of metrics and targets that are measurable and harmonized. So if we're all trying to measure the same thing and report the same thing, you know, you can see if somebody's then saying something completely different or leaving something out. So it comes down to that sort of harmonized approach with measurable metrics and transparency and a comparable sort of results. So that would be my suggestion for preventing greenwashing, because you can sort of see what one company is doing compared to another and see if it makes sense or not.
Yeah, no, so fully agree with you, Justin. Very little for me to add. You know, maybe back to one comment I made. We need to be honest. We're at the beginning of it. This is very hard. It requires a lot of parties, right, involved. And so it's too early to claim victory. We figured it out. We've done it. It's not enough data points, not enough transactions, right? Justin should have 20 transactions to talk to you about. I should have another 20, right? So we need to do way more to be able to, you know, declare that we have figured out how to value, how to price, how to protect, and so forth, and finance this NbS. So we're at the beginning. We need to be honest, right? And then back to your point, Justin, around transparency, standardization, so we can, you know, reasonably compare where we stand.
Probably one last question. How can insurers, reinsurance, and the banking industry work together to create new products, to create new inflows into NbS? There must be some opportunity.
Absolutely. I can tell you that I'm going to have a follow-up call with Justin right after this event. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, maybe Justin, if I may, I'm happy to start. We are very complementary, right, with the funding, the asset management side of the banks and the insurers, right? So the banks can help us, and the asset managers can help us to identify these natural assets that need to be de-risked, that are faced with natural, you know, exposure or man-made type of risks, where insurers can provide solutions, so they can fund them, right? They can finance them, and then they can happen. So this is all about identifying, sourcing opportunities, natural assets that need to be, you know, supported, protected, grow, and so forth. And so if you think about the value chain of any kind of project, at the very early stage, we need to work more closely together, right? The banks and insurers in identifying, sourcing, and then finding the right combination to de-risk and finance, or, you know, or finance in order to de-risk. So that's the complementarity and synergies I see.
Agreed. And I mean, the key word for me is sustainability. We're all aiming for the same thing here, whether it's financial stability, environmental stability, you know, natural capital stability. We're all working together with the same objectives. So definitely we can leverage off each other, and we're aiming for the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's something which can happen. I remember because the regulation is different for reinsurance and banking industry. So we have Basel III on the other side, and then the reinsurance regulation on the other side, which are completely different, like the opposite of each other. And there must be some products which can be available where risk is transferred from reinsurance companies to banks, and the other way around.
I think it's that changing from these risks into opportunities. Yeah, and how we view that. So it's identifying the risks, flipping them over, turning them into opportunities for the overall objective of financial and environmental stability.
Totally agree. So I guess there's just one last question. I said that it will be the last question, the previous one, but there's one question from the audience. So the TNFD, will it change the world and help financing NbS or not?
Philippe, would you like to go ahead?
The TCFD of the FSB.
Yes, the TCFD of nature.
Now, look, we need, you know, back to my comment about convergence and global standard, right? So the TCFD is a great initiative we were very privileged as we were invited to participate from the beginning, right? So we are at the table. We are one of the very few insurers contributing, and we now spend a lot of time going around the world and telling other regulators on the financial services side to use the TCFD and not reinvent the wheel, right? So yes, it can definitely make a big difference and can really be a breaker, an opener to a proper recognition of the value of nature-based solutions in climate disclosure, climate adaptation benefits, implications. So we need to monitor a little bit the preparation for COP26, need to monitor what could be the outcome when it comes to integrating these global standards in countries' commitment and making place and room for nature-based or natural assets. And then we can see a breakthrough. So I am a strong believer and supporter of TCFD because it could be a global standard and base for improvement, and not the puzzle we're trying to reconcile with too many initiatives around the world.
And just to add on that, Philippe, you're referring to the TCFD there, and likewise the TNFD. So they've modeled themselves on the TCFD. I think they've worked really hard to understand what worked and what didn't work when implementing the TCFD. So it remains to be seen whether it's as successful, but the ideas, the objectives are the same, that the lessons they've learned hopefully will be helpful. And yeah, let's hope that it has as much of an impact and is widely accepted as the TCFD is.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much for your time. It has been terrific, especially the Q&A session is something I enjoyed the most because it's kind of interactive, and it was really great having you on the panel and answering the questions. Thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, everyone, for bearing with me on my technical issues and the support. Thanks, everyone.
That's fine.
Thank you, everyone, for a really fantastic presentation and Q&A session. It was really good. So if you're still online, everyone, it'd be great if you can join our, once again, on the Mentimeter, just to get a sense of what have you taken away. And so we already see some answers. Says that your takeaway is that it's early days for nature-based solutions, but there's great potential. The cost of keeping nature is difficult to calculate, but we need to find ways of protecting it. It is important to build connections. Building connections was also something that was highlighted this morning. Complementarity of nature-based solutions as a climate solution with financing strategies. We also have private finance for NbS is much lower than private finance for climate finance at the moment. Yep, that was the point made by Sasha. Anybody else like to add their last thoughts in relation to finance, insurance, and management for nature-based solutions? Nature-based solutions insurance is the way to go. Yeah, I'm sure Swiss Re is very happy to hear that. Excellent presentations. So yes, a round of applause for everybody. Making better standards and changes commercially viable. Looking forward for Horizon Europe. And de-risking nature and using insurance and reinsurance is such a brilliant space for upcoming nature-based solutions professionals to be in. So great to hear a lot of good takeaway messages, and also a lot of thanks and really amazing. So this is really to all of the presenters and to Sasha. And so I will stop sharing this screen now and just move on to my final set of slides. But before I do that, once again, really a round of applause for Philippe, Brahim, Justine Bolton, and also Sasha as an excellent host and moderator. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been really a pleasure to have you to conclude this workshop series. It's absolutely fantastic. So I thank you. I'm just going to share once again just the final slides, if I can find them. So yes, mainly to let you all know that this session has been recorded. You can find the sessions on the We Value Nature platform, which our colleague will place in the chat, and that if you go there, you'll be able to see a quiz, and the quiz is really important for you to be able to receive a certificate of participation. And you can still get a certificate of participation if you have friends, or if your colleagues can still receive one. If they haven't seen the workshop live, they can watch the recording. And also really important is if you watch all three, or if you followed all three of the workshops and completed the quizzes, you can earn a certificate of a completion. And you need at least a 70% score to pass to receive your certificate. So I hope you watched intently. Once again, I want to thank you for all attending this workshop series. It's been a really fascinating journey with some really great presenters. And if you're really also piqued to learn more about nature-based solutions for disaster and climate resilience, you want to have some more examples of what that might look like and how it can be used by different sectors. Also, if for just you as an individual, what can you do about nature-based solutions? And please come and check out our online course at peder.org/MOOC. This is a short online course which has at the moment over 45,000 participants, and is one of the highest ranking courses in environmental sector on edX. So come and check it out. Once again, thank you for joining today, and I wish you well. Bye.
And I'm really glad that we have representatives from the two big groups in our session today. So we have Sherry Gray from Swiss Re, and we have Oliver Witters from Credit Suisse, who are both specialists in nature-based solutions and nature-based NbS finance, and will present their views on how to scale, how to look into different solutions. So first of all, I will leave the stage to Oliver, and I keep my introduction relatively short. So Oliver joined recently Credit Suisse, where he is the biodiversity lead within Sustainability Strategy and Advisory Department. And from my perspective, this is a huge step towards the right direction. Having a dedicated biodiversity lead within the bank is something relatively new, and it should become mainstream going forward. Oliver joined from Zoological Society of London, where he has successfully implemented blue and green economy projects. And his presentation today will be on blue economy. Oliver, over to you.
Thanks, Sasha. Hopefully everyone can see the cover slide. So as Sasha alluded to, I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive around oceans. And I suspect that some people were hoping that I would go into the detail of a particular transaction or product or mechanism. But I think it's really important for the broader stakeholder audience to understand that we have different lenses that all stakeholders are applying to our everyday business. And so for us, a lens that we use is the SDGs, and that allowed us to do a deep dive on oceans. If we go to the next slide, please, Natalie. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because I believe if you've dialed into this session, you are already drinking the Kool-Aid, right? You are a believer, and we know that biodiversity and nature-based solutions have a critical role to play. And this is really just a summary of the benefits that we see coming from the ocean. And so almost acknowledging the ocean as a macro nature-based solution that is made up potentially of many, many building blocks that are in their own rights nature-based solutions. A lot of these figures and stats will be familiar to you guys. But again, this is all the macro materiality of the ocean as a nature-based solution. Next slide, please. So as I said, you know, everyone's looking at their role in society through different lenses. And I think that the SDGs have provided some standardization around how those lenses can be better aligned across stakeholder groups. For us, that meant understanding, okay, when we look at the SDGs, where do we see a shortage of capital being allocated? And Sasha has just summarized for us the massive shortfall that we see occurring in nature-based solutions. And you see that we see this through our lens as a failure on a particular SDG, right? So life underwater. Now, that's really important because, as Sasha said, we need to plug that financing gap, but different stakeholders are going to have different focal areas, right? And for us, a particular area of interest is the oceans. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we know that oceans do present a massive investment opportunity, but that's got to be also sensible and logical in terms of we can't cover everything all at once, right? And I think we are all probably tired of hearing the low-hanging fruit term, but we do need to focus on sectors where we see the highest opportunity for bankable deals, growth, and ultimately investment return. And that's the critical thing here. If we want financing to flow, it still needs to be a bankable deal. It's not magic money that doesn't need a return. Now, when we look at a number of these sectors, we see that these ultimately have some sort of commercial or bankable aspect to them. We also know, however, that as the narrative and the discussion around biodiversity is evolving, we're beginning to value the outcomes from biodiversity more effectively. And that will, over time, unlock more investment opportunities or more subsectors, if you will, that the finance sector can really participate in. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this for us was really an interesting process where we did a survey with a number of investors to understand what their understanding of the blue economy was. And the really positive feedback is investors want exposure to the oceans, right? And they are predicting that this is going to be, in the future, a growingly important space for all stakeholders to be focused on, right? However, and this is the critical piece that I believe is where we are in terms of a market, is the bottom section, which outlines the majority of opportunities exist predominantly in early stage investments, debt and blended finance instruments. And going back to Sasha's comments, we have to plug that funding gap, but we also have to be focused on plugging that funding gap over the long term. It's not just about hitting some numbers this year or next year. It's about how do we grow this market so that in 10 years' time, the numbers are reflecting what we need them to reflect. And I go back to Sasha's comments around, we know that nature-based solutions can play a significant role in terms of climate mitigation, right? And there are some proposals at the moment around trying to ring fence 30% of climate financing for nature-based solutions. And no one would be happier with that than me. However, we have to be pragmatic. That is, again, the long-term 10-year plan. The concern we have is that we simply do not have the projects at scale today to deploy that quantum of funding, right? And so whilst we are all pushing towards more funding coming into the market, we have to be savvy and smart about building this market responsibly so that in 10 years' time, those numbers are real and substantiated by proper bankable deals. Next slide, please. So this for us is also where we ask investors, what do we think the biggest challenges are to being able to invest in the ocean? And number one, lack of investment grade projects and scale. So that shouldn't mean that we all throw our toys out the cot and stop working. It just says to us, we need to focus on and acknowledge where we are in terms of market development. And this is really important because, as Sasha said, we've got a funding gap at the moment. And the sad reality is that that funding gap probably is not at the mature stage. If there were mature opportunities, there would be capital available in the markets. The challenge is we just don't have those mature opportunities. And so what perhaps we need to start discussing is, do we have the right types of financing available for the market where it is today, right? And so how do we bring in more capital that's got a higher risk tolerance, and how do we get smarter around blended finance opportunities where there is an opportunity to de-risk transactions in order to catalyze that private sector capital in. We've also got to acknowledge that a really important point, I think, is this lack of definitions that we see as the third point identified by investors. We throw around terms like nature positive, and we will very often acknowledge, oh, there's fantastic benefits that come from this nature-based solution. But sometimes we have not necessarily got the specific science and best practice and data that supports each individual transaction. And I think very often we complain about a lack of data at a market level, but at a transaction level, I think that we can do a lot more in terms of understanding exactly what those outcomes are for each individual project. And this is where we need to see a better feedback loop occurring between what we as the investment sector or the insurance sector need to see, right? And that needs to be feeding back into the science and the research and the piloting and the trialing that's going on now. And that's why it's so fantastic that we have forums like this to start having these discussions and start creating and formalizing those feedback loops. So, you know, Oppla's involvement in this is so critical, because having that repository of learnings is exactly how we will grow this market in a responsible manner. If we go to the next slide, please. So this talks to what can we do now? And in 10 years' time, as I said, we would like to be deploying billions and billions into nature-based solutions. But we're not at that stage yet. And I think that we all have a collective responsibility in terms of managing expectations amongst stakeholders that are perhaps doubtful or detractors of nature-based solutions as a solution, right? And let's be clear again, if you've dialed into this call, you probably already are bought into the narrative that we can move the dial using nature-based solutions. However, we really are still a minority. And so we need to acknowledge where we are in terms of that market. And whilst we sometimes all want to go to 1,000,000 miles an hour and get deals done now, the reality is that we've got a bunch of people that we need to take on a journey. And so first and foremost for us is actually around raising awareness. So in the case of oceans, 75% of our investors had not assessed their investments in terms of ocean impact or risk exposure, right? So there's a starting point that we need to start having this conversation in a broader church, right? And again, it's fantastic that we are collectively all here, but we all need to now go out and spread this gospel. And that's about raising awareness and raising engagement, you know, and demonstrating a degree of patience that we need to build the market before we can start allocating hundreds of billions of dollars, because we simply don't have the project pipeline yet, and we don't have the full buy-in. So I think raising engagement with the financial sector, with asset managers is a starting point, and we saw that, you know, on climate. And then critically, I think the third piece is partnerships. You know, and Sasha touched on this, is, you know, we've got to be working more collectively and understanding that we all want to grow the market. I mean, it's in the financial sector's best interests to have an emerging market where we can deploy capital and generate returns, right? It's in our interest to have that occur. But we need to make sure that that occurs in a responsible manner and that we're growing this market in a responsible manner. Because I think the last thing any of us wants is a significant blowout on something which then sets us back 5 years or a decade. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Oliver. This was quite interesting, and I think okay, this is the right beginning to go into the right direction in financing nature-based solutions. What we do right now, I will give the stage to Sherry, and we will do a Q&A session afterwards. So Sherry is the global lead for sustainability and market development at Swiss Re. And Sherry has a special focus on public sector solutions. But from her experience, she worked in the reinsurance industry, the primary insurance industry, across different departments in leading positions. And I'm really glad that we have someone from Swiss Re here at our workshop, because Swiss Re is in the forefront of nature-based solutions, not only investments, but research and development. And I think that the reinsurance industry is in a unique position to have not only the risk part of the of NbS, but turning the risk part into an investment opportunity. With these words, over to you, Sherry.
Thanks, Sasha. Hi, everybody. Well, if we move to the next slide, I'll just firstly introduce Swiss Re and just give a bit of context as to why we're here and why it's important. Because for us, our mission is to really make the world more resilient. And, we're a global reinsurer and insurer, which means that we work with insurers, we work with governments, and we also work with corporates on risk transfer solutions. And sustainability is embedded through our business. It's a factor in our decision making. And, one of our important commitments is our net zero commitments. And what we've done is we've actually said our operations will be net zero by 2030. So that's our own, footprint as a business. But by 2050, we also want to be net zero on both sides of the balance sheet. So on our underwriting portfolio, as well as our asset management portfolio. But today's focus is more around the insurance and underwriting side. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to start with, I guess, the chart that just really shows the rising costs of the losses that we're seeing around the world from natural catastrophes. And, you can see the trend that's going up and up and up. But if you actually look at the green bars, that's actually the part that isn't insured. So these are the losses that don't get reimbursed, that don't get compensated for. And that's an average of, 70% in terms of the exposure. But what actually isn't captured in this chart is the uninsured losses to our natural assets and the eco services, because we don't yet properly capture the economic value of nature, particularly in terms of revenue generation. So it remains exposed and what we call part of the protection gap. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show some numbers that probably are familiar to you. So in terms of this protection gap, 55%, over half, that's about 44 trillion of the world's GDP, is dependent on nature and the services it provides. And by way of example, coral reefs are estimated to provide 36 billion in terms of tourism revenue and economic value. But there's also the resilience value as well that nature provides. And if we go back to the coral reefs, they're actually estimated to protect 272 billion. So that's like 7 times, the revenue they generate, they provide in terms of protection for property and economic activity. And even mangroves, is another example, are estimated to protect about 65 billion worth in property and the lives of over 15 million people. So with those examples in mind, we'll go to the next slide and talk about how insurance can help. And firstly, if we can actually acknowledge the dependencies and the benefits of nature, we can integrate that into our business planning, into our risk management, and all of our commercial decision making. And once we assign a value to it, nature can then become an insurable asset. And if it's impacted by a specific defined event, like a storm, an earthquake, a hurricane, then we can actually provide insurance for it. And that's what we've been doing at Swiss Re. I mean, we've been doing insurance and underwriting for 180 years, you know, paying claims and helping design programs that actually strengthen the economic resilience. So we want to be able to apply this same expertise and thinking to natural capital as an extension of protecting things that are of value. I mean, you insure your property, you insure your houses, your cars, you insure your health, you know, your life. And I mean, so why can't we insure the natural assets? Because they arguably have a huge environmental impact, economic, health, and social benefits. So for businesses, you know, if you recognize where there's dependencies on nature and incorporate that into your broader risk and insurance programs, you can actually protect against loss and business interruption, probably in the same way that you're currently actually taking out property and machinery breakdown covers. For investors, we really want to encourage more resilient and green infrastructure around the globe. But a lot of it is currently catalysed with donor funds and on a small scale, as you know, Oliver was talking about. So we really want to help these projects to be designed and managed in the same way as bigger commercial grey projects. And that means you actually take on board the same assurances. You plan, you de-risk, you use insurance to actually help enable these projects. And that in turn assures the returns, which will attract more private investment. And for governments, an insurance program means that there's always going to be funds for cleanup and recovery after a natural catastrophe event, without delays, without having to redirect funds from other projects, without having to raise taxes or introduce a new levy. It's really recommended that you include insurance in your upfront planning. So on the next slide, I've got a couple of case studies to show this in action. So on the left, we have Texel Island in the Netherlands. It's a beautiful World Heritage Site, but it's at risk of rising sea levels. And in 2019, the existing dike needed to be reinforced, and they did this with a new sand dike, and they also planted grasses to help minimise the erosion risk. And because this design was so innovative and on a World Heritage Site, it required some stringent assurances to get the local government approvals and buy-in of the community. So we provided insurance cover that protected the contractors and project against risk and damages. And this is an example of where insurance enabled the construction of a nature-based solution. On the right, we've got the Mesoamerican Reef in Quintana Roo, Mexico, which was the site of the first nature-based insurance cover. So the main benefit of this program was actually realised after the event. And in this case, that event was Hurricane Delta in October last year. It was a parametric insurance design, which meant that the funds were actually available once the hurricane was registered. And then that meant that there was prompt recovery action, which meant that the people that you see here in the photo, the reef brigades, actually could head out and collect all the broken pieces and get straight into the restoration once the waters had actually calmed down. So on the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit more around the types of insurance and what solutions are available. So at the top, we've got, I guess, the traditional indemnity-based insurance. This is what you currently have on your car or your home. And in the case of Texel Island, if there was a severe weather event, it would require the project owners to consider the damage, and then that loss to be confirmed by the insurer and a loss adjuster who goes out on site, inspects it, and then the claim is processed for payment. At the bottom, you can see the difference with parametric insurance. So this is where a payment is agreed to be made with a predefined triggering event. So in the case of the Mexico Reef, the hurricane location and the intensity was agreed up front. The required payout was also agreed up front. So when the hurricane passed through the agreed location at the agreed intensity or higher, it automatically triggered the claim. So you can see that there's a lot of speed in a parametric solution. So it relies on objective, often public data, rather than a specialised assessment, which is great because it means that payouts can be as fast as 2 weeks. But it also carries some risk that the damage may be greater or less than the actual agreed payout amount. And we call this the basis risk. So on to the next slide. I guess just some key components to take action, right? To actually get the right insurance solution for your natural asset or your nature-based solution. So, I mean, firstly, we've got to identify what's the asset, what's the eco-service that needs to be protected, or what's the project that you actually want to achieve and how can it be de-risked. And then once you actually understand the risks, if they're defined, if they're measurable, then they can actually be insurable. And then think about what your payout needs are. You know, so what's actually needed for recovery? How much does it cost? How often is it actually going to happen? And last but not least, the most critical component is who's going to pay for it, right? Because this is still a commercial transaction. You know, we're making a commercial action here, an investment. So where's the premium going to come from? And importantly, you know, insurance tends to be an annual program, or you can have a multi-year program. So think about the longevity. How are you actually going to ensure the sustainability of premiums over the long term? And this is where we've seen the development of some really successful public-private partnerships here. So I'll just briefly talk about what we're doing at Swiss Re and how we're taking action within our own business. So on the next slide, you will see the long history that Swiss Re has of sustainability. We were talking about it before it was cool. You know, in 1979 is when we were first publishing information and views on it. And one of the key things that we have embedded in our business is our sustainable business risk framework. So you can see that that was formalized in 2009. And this is I guess, a process and policy that really determines all of our underwriting and investment decisions. So, for example, we don't do business with companies that cause harm to the environment or, you know, don't respect human rights. And we've got various sector-specific policies. The other thing that we've done is, you know, we've got a really strong ESG investment strategy. And we focus on, I guess, 3 main themes: enhancement, where we've got ESG benchmarking and minimum standards for investment. We also have inclusion as a key theme. And these are thematic investments that support net zero, climate change, and increasing social infrastructure. And of course, we have exclusion. So as per our sustainable business risk framework, we have been avoiding carbon intensive companies, and we've also withdrawn from thermal coal. So like Credit Suisse, we also use the SDGs to measure our impact. On the next slide, there's a couple of examples of some case studies, but I might leave that until the Q&A, and then I can ask Oliver to share more about how he actually applies it at Credit Suisse. And what we do is we actually align all of our business lines with the SDGs. We identify where our products have a positive, negative, and neutral impact. And we use that to inform our KPIs and also our business steering and product design. And in order to actually help us do that, we've had to create some tools. And I've given some examples on the following slide. So, for example, we've started to develop an SDG Cakulator to monitor our own progress, to track our portfolio, and to set KPIs. And so because, you know, we've done it ourselves and we're using ourselves as the own test case, it's something that we can also share with our clients, with other insurers, asset managers, and corporate companies. And then on the right, we developed the biodiversity and ecosystem index as part of our, I guess, broader research into this space. And what that does is it assesses the state of 10 different ecosystems. And we've integrated that into our CatNet tool. And this is a tool that we use to actually look at storm tracks, major flood sites, population data, and also climate scenarios. So now all of that information is actually in the one place. And it's a tool that, you know, our underwriters use, but it's also used by over 15,000 insurance professionals globally, and a number of governments and universities to help inform their planning and portfolio steering. So to wrap up, I will just, I guess, acknowledge, you know, some of the challenges and the hurdles that we have. So if we move to the next slide, and a lot of them you would have heard Oliver refer to as well. But I guess firstly, the most important thing is that we actually have to recognise the benefits of nature, you know, and incorporate that into our commercial decision making. Scaling and standardising is also critical. You know, the initiatives are usually small and localised, as Oliver points out. But if we actually aggregate these and treat these innovations as broad commercial projects, they're going to be more attractive to private investment, and we can share the best practice as we go. And lastly, I mean, we all know that it's the right thing to do, and many of us are making choices, the right choices, but it's still a choice. You know, it's still a voluntary action. But this is where private sector organisations and governments can accelerate action by mandating the disclosures and compliance requirements. So I'll just close up there. I expect we'll talk a lot more about the challenges and opportunities. And back to you, Sasha.